So, coming out of post-fundamentalism, or being in post-fundamentalism rather, there's a lot of various traumas that I've dealt with. And in the last 14 years, I thought that I had dealt with pretty much all of it. But in pregnancy and in the fertility journey to get to this point, I've discovered that there's a lot of unresolved trauma in regards to pregnancy and family planning and fertility and all of those things. And I feel like it's definitely not talked about. Something that I've noticed in like the support groups and stuff that I'm in, there's a lot of talk about like the deconstruction process and what life looks like post fundamentalism and like kind of recovering from that, the trauma of growing up in a cult. But for women, I think that something that isn't talked about, and it's something that is taboo in non-religious or non-post-religious circles in general, is like we just don't talk about fertility issues enough. We don't talk about pregnancy loss and all of those things nearly enough. So then you feel really isolated in it, and that's not healthy. So here we are. I'm going to share a little bit of what I've been dealing with, how I've been dealing with it, and a disclaimer, this is with the lens of somebody that has left fundamentalism entirely, but is still a believer. So if you're watching this and you're not a believer, this is not me putting any of my beliefs on you or trying to encourage you to try faith or religion again. That's not what is happening here. I have utmost respect for everybody's journey. It all looks different for all of us, but there are just some deeply seated things in me that I know that somebody else has to be dealing with this. Somebody else has to have dealt with this or will deal with it in the future. And if nobody talks about it, then you will feel absolutely crazy for feeling this way. So disclaimer over. Here we go. Growing up in the independent fundamental Baptist church and in various other kind of oppressive religious systems, I know it's very similar. It's a similar experience in this regard. I was taught that as a woman, my value came from being a wife and having a family, having children. And for years and years, even after I left the fundamentalist church, I still really resonated with that as something that I wanted for myself. To be a good godly wife and have lots of kids and do all these things. But that is not the story that I've gotten to live. There's been a lot of heartache in that. And it's weird right now being 7 months pregnant and dealing with the grief and the trauma when there's a part of me that feels like, oh, I should just be joyful and gracious and happy all the time. And then when I like peel back some of those layers, I realize, oh, that is just more of the deeply ingrained indoctrination of what Christian womanhood looks like. And not to say that it's not a good thing to have a husband and have a family and all those things. They're wonderful things. But to say that it is the be-all, end-all of what a Christian woman should strive for is really, really detrimental. I grew up in the Quiverful movement. And if you don't know what the Quiverful movement is, there's a verse about having lots of arrows in your quiver to fight the enemy. And I should have done my research before I sat down and did this video, but it was definitely portrayed in the context of the more children you have, the greater your chances are of evangelizing the world. And that is the mark of true Christian womanhood and true Christian motherhood, that you would, from a young age, disciple your 15 kids to be unashamed of the gospel and to share the gospel and all these things, which I still believe are important things. Like, as a woman and a wife and a believer that is about to be a mother, it is important to me to instill values upon my kid that they develop their own relationship with the Lord and love the Lord so much for themselves that they want to share that with people. That's where I'm at now, but that's not the ideology necessarily that I grew up with. It was a requirement, not a hey, I want you to have the opportunity to grow and learn and be passionate the way I am. It was the expectation that you would. And that comes with its own set of things. That's not the purpose of this video. It's not the purpose of this conversation. But anyways, I'm going to get into a little bit of my journey and kind of the things that are trauma triggers for me that I have stepped into more than once along this journey. And yeah. Okay. So, growing up with the expectation and the ideology that as a woman, my only value comes from my husband and my children, the natural course of action is after you graduate high school, you then quickly find a husband so that you can have value outside of your biological family, the nuclear family that you grew up with, and then you develop your own nuclear family and all these things. I left fundamentalism when I was 14, but I hadn't... Deconstruction wasn't a thing. It wasn't something that was talked about. It wasn't something that was shared. It was just what was believed by the church that I grew up in, and then I kind of believed for myself, was that I just rebelled against the church and I left. And according to the church, my leaving and finding a different church that wasn't a fundamentalist church was just as bad as me becoming an atheist that not only didn't believe in God, but tried to bring everybody with me and, destroy people's lives and destroy the church and all these things. It was just as bad as that in their eyes. Not in mine. But I didn't think that much better of myself in the time period. I definitely thought of myself as a rebellious teenager that was leaving to figure it out for myself. And I left the covering and the umbrella of authority and all of these things. Started going to the Pentecostal church down the road with my grandma. That was fun. But I hadn't begun to examine the just really twisted ideologies that had been taught to me for, a decade and a half. Now, I will put in the disclaimer that I grew up the daughter of a single mother. My mom was never married. It wasn't even like she'd gotten divorced from my father or anything like that. So it was very much growing up, I was treated like, I was almost treated like a pastor's kid because my uncle was the associate pastor at our church. And because my father wasn't in the church had placed him as my spiritual authority. So I was treated like a pastor's kid with the expectations that I would behave in a certain way, but also everybody waiting for me to fail like my mother did. I don't believe that my mother is a failure in any way, just to throw that out there too. But, being treated by the people that I was around constantly, like both a pastor's kid and a bastard kid, that did a number on me. So when I left, I think that there was no surprise because I was bound to fail in some way. But I never dealt with any of the just crap in my mind mentally that had really just been spoken over me and ingrained in me. The way I thought about myself was pretty pathetic because of how I was treated by everybody except for my mom and my grandparents. And my grandparents were like, don't drink the Kool-Aid, okay, guys? It wasn't until after I left fundamentalism that I Googled don't drink the Kool-Aid and figured out what that was about. I still, at that point, didn't even believe that I had grown up in a cult. So that was fun, that my grandpa called it. He was that kind of guy. But anyways, I left the church and I didn't deal with any of the teachings that had been really twisted and just really messed up. And then I ended up getting engaged at 17, getting married a month after I turned 18, like a good little fundamental Baptist girl. And we immediately started trying for a family. And my body just couldn't handle it. Over the course of like the first 8 months of my marriage, I lost 3 pregnancies. And I remember then and for a long time after wondering what sin I had committed that I had not yet confessed, that God would be punishing me and not allowing me to have children. Because my value was so deeply held in the idea that to be a good Christian woman, I had to be a mother. And that because I couldn't be a mother. It had to be because I had sinned. I had done something unforgivable that God would not let me bring children into this world. It feels really weird to say that out loud, because I do think that there's still a part of me that wants to believe that to be truth. I know that it's not. But trauma is just funky. It's just weird. And you can say that you don't believe something about yourself 15 times and still it will kind of sneak its way back in. So yeah, that thought process would not end, and it would only be compounded by the fact that I ultimately got divorced about a year after my last miscarriage in that marriage. And we won't go into the details of why I got divorced, but it wasn't a good situation. But now, walking out of that, again, still having not dealt with any of the twisted ideologies that I had grown up with, now I believed that I had at some point committed a secret sin that God was punishing me for. And that was why I couldn't have kids. And now I got divorced, which is like the cardinal sin. I was the one that filed for divorce. So it was just like stacking things like one on top of the other. And here I am, the chief of sinners, and God can never use me. God will never bless me with a family. I'm never going to find a man who will want to marry me because I'm broken. I'm being punished by God. All of these things. Fast forward probably 5 years from that point, I finally started dealing with the crap. Started dealing with a lot of what had been spoken over me and a lot of the lies that have been told, and the spiritual abuse, the emotional abuse, the mental abuse that came from growing up in a cult. But I held really tightly to the idea that my infertility was my fault. Like, I did something. And God would not forgive me and unlock the floodgates of my reproductive system until I had discovered what this thing was and dealt with it. But I never said that out loud, and I never really truly admitted it to myself, but I definitely held on to it really tight. So then I meet my husband, who's wonderful and sitting right behind the camera. He's wonderful even if he's not sitting right behind the camera. And I'm like, okay, God brought a person into my life that is willing to love me in spite of the fact that I'm the chief of sinners and divorced and evil and all of these awful things that I kept speaking over myself. At that point, it was nobody else's fault. It was my own. I kept believing those things. I kept holding on to those things. And then we had miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. And then the trauma reared its ugly head again. What did I do? What did I do that God is punishing me in this way, and now my husband is being punished for it because he deserves a legacy and all of these things. And then, when you're married to a good man and he gets the slightest inkling of you starting to think that these things that are not your fault and literally just your body not doing what your body is supposed to do. He's like, this. There's been more than one time that he's been like, this is not your fault. This is not. If we can't have children, we can't have children. If we can't have children of our own, but we want to grow our family, there are other ways to do it. Like, it's really freeing being married to a really good human. Just want to throw that out there. But my goodness, the amount of crap that I brought in to my marriage because of my own belief about myself. But that's not why I had all the miscarriages. Anyways, I am bewildered by the grace that I've experienced in this whole process. The grace that my husband has had for me, because had he grown up the way I grew up, his character is not that he would blame shift or anything like that. But had he grown up in fundamentalism, it would be very easy for him to fall into that same thought process of maybe not necessarily blaming me, but like, what did I do? What did we do? What did you do? Like, falling into that, like, God's punishing us thought process. So, anyways, in July of 2023, we conceived a pregnancy that finally stuck. And I'm sitting here with a cup of coffee, sitting on my baby. And every single day, I fight the demon that says something's going to go wrong today. Today's going to be the day that solidifies no, you really did something and God really is punishing you. You would think that as you get closer and closer to your due date, and after you hit the point of viability, and, you reach all these milestones, you would think that you would begin to relax more. But I can't. There is a deep-seated part of me that falls into the trap of believing that I deserve to be punished for. Insert laundry list of lifelong humanity here. And ultimately what that comes from is there's a part of me that believes that God is more vengeful than he is good. And then, saying that out loud makes you go, oh no, I don't like that. But I think when dealing with religious trauma as a believer, like as somebody who still believes in God and does believe that God is good, and does pursue a relationship with God outside of the legalism and outside of the rules and outside of the expectations, you kind of have to admit that you're trying to tell God that he's something that he's not. And that, like, when I sit and think about it, that is actually the thing that takes the edge off of those moments of fears, that no, God's not going to punish me. God's not going to take my child from me because I did X, Y, or Z. God's not going to punish me because I'm unfit, or whatever lie I begin to believe about myself. But it's hard. It's hard to, like, look at pregnancy as a gift when I have for so long believed that I don't deserve this gift. And I think that is something that is going to be really redemptive at the end of this process. It's been a pretty hard pregnancy. I've been real sick, and I've not had a beautiful, blessed, enjoyable pregnancy that was portrayed to me growing up as what pregnancy should be, which is another can of worms, another area of trauma, another area where it's easy for me to feel like I'm being punished, but it's not true. It's literally genetic. Goodness. But I do think that it's something that's going to be really redemptive by the time we get to the end of the pregnancy and I get to hold a little girl in my arms. That even though I believed so many lies about myself, and that God looks at me and says, you're still worthy and I still have good things for you. It's pretty powerful for me to just find the pockets of time where I can let myself rest in that. I wish that growing up had been different. I wish that there had been more talk of pregnancy just not being easy and it not necessarily being a joyful thing, and not being normalized. But again, I was sold a lie and I bought in, and now I have to deal with the trauma of that. But I can still find the moments where I can be exponentially grateful. Because even on the days that I do struggle, if I step back and look at all of it, this entire journey, I see a God who says, you are still worthy and I still have good things for you. So if you're dealing with years and years of infertility, or you've experienced loss, or you're grieving, or you're just having a crappy pregnancy, and you have felt this way, if you resonate with any of this, if you're dealing with unresolved religious trauma and how that affects every aspect of your life, especially this season that you're in, you're not alone. You're not crazy. And you're not being punished. You are still worthy of good things, and God still loves you. You've not been abandoned. You've not been forgotten. God is still good, even when it doesn't feel like it. God is still good, even when years of oppression would tell you that God is being vengeful in this moment. That's just the enemy trying to rob you. Just the enemy trying to shift your focus away from who God is. Don't buy in anymore. You're going to be okay. This season isn't forever. And even if it is, God is still good. And you are still worthy of good things.